it's okay for you to stay in a job or take on a job that may not be that fulfillment for you. And that's okay, because you can do a job without necessarily attaching your identity to it and sow the seeds around it for what you really think is going to fulfill you.
If you don't adapt your communication according to the dominant culture, in fact, the culture itself kind of spits you out. It's almost like you are not willing to know us to a point where you can meet us where we are, and then we have a genuine connection. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Organizational Behavior with Siphiwe Moyo. Today's guest is an incredible human being. She's a friend, and I'm really looking forward to have this conversation with her. Dr. Damini Chawla is an award-winning professional speaker with a unique multicultural background that spans from India and China to Australia and Singapore. With a lifelong passion for human connection and behavior, including over 13 years in clinical dentistry, her mission is to help others build courage and trust, calm anxieties, and spark genuine conversations. Often described as pluripotent. I knew that was a trap. I knew I was not going to get that word right. She'll correct me later. She masterfully takes on diverse responsibilities and easily adapts to challenges using her highly valuable multifaceted leadership communication skills in dynamic and fast-paced work environments. So ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, please welcome Dr. Damini Chawla.
Oh, I love the sound effect.
Me too. Welcome. How are you?
I'm really well. Thank you, Siphiwe. Thank you for having me.
How's been your day? What have you done today? Or you've been waiting for this recording?
Yeah, it's all I've done today. Wait for this recording, actually. No, that's a lie. I've been talking about you.
Okay, that's
all
a good
awful
thing.
things.
That's it. Oh, by the way, before we start, what does pluripotent mean?
So pluripotent is a word used for a type of cell in the human body that can adapt and change to take on lots of different roles. So it can specialize very quickly to take on different roles.
Aha, and hence the adapting to challenges and so on that you are.
That's
basically.
Correct.
All right, cool. I think you might have had this question before, but maybe our viewers and listeners might not be familiar with you. So please share your journey from practicing dentistry to become an award-winning speaker and coach. What led you to this type of work and that transition, by the way?
So thanks for asking, Siphiwe. It's been a really wild journey, actually. And I think, I wouldn't say that one thing is more fulfilling than the other necessarily. However, I picked dentistry when I was 17. I finished high school, and that was when that decision was made to go into to go study dentistry and become a dentist. And I think it served me really well, and I've really enjoyed being a clinical dentist. But I think somewhere along the way, I started to feel like there's got to be more to life than just teeth. Surely, there's a whole human being attached to the set of teeth. And I also started to feel like actually the parts of the work that I enjoyed the most was the human connection and relationships and building trust with people. So over the years, as I've been practicing dentistry, I realized that I sort of, without necessarily meaning to, ended up creating a niche where I would see a lot of pediatric patients and a lot of adults with high dental anxiety. And, if you look at the pattern with those patients, really the focus is you're not doing very high-end, very high-tech dentistry. You're doing pretty basic dentistry, but you're really building a lot of trust and creating that space for people to be comfortable enough. And so I think over the years, I started to feel a little bit like, okay, what next? And what more can I do with what I already have trained in? And I'm a bit of a perfectionist, which you probably know by now, from what little you know of me. And the actual physical clinical dentistry was not very enjoyable for me after a certain point, because, you get to a certain skill level and then you're just kind of repeating the same thing over and over again, but you're not necessarily sort of growing or flourishing in that space. And so I think it was all of those things combined that made me start to think about what's next and what more, and how can I have wider impact than the one-to-one impact that I'm currently having on these people's lives. And so then, like any good, I say brown kid, but any good Asian kid probably, it was, do I go do an MBA? Because obviously an MBA is the answer to everybody's life problems.
Absolutely.
So do I go do an MBA? And then I thought, I really wouldn't do very much with that. And then I explored the path of, doing a master's in public health and going into policy making. But as you know, Singapore is a really small place. There's really not that much room for growth within the policy making space in healthcare specifically. And then, one day I just decided that I didn't need to know what was next. It was wild because I've always had a plan for my life. I've never not planned it. And actually this is November. I have 2 daughters and they're both born in November, 2 years apart. So that's the kind of planning we're talking about. It's very, very different and out there for me to just say, okay, I'm going to quit my job and not have a plan for what comes after. And so I did that, and it's been amazing because the journey from there to being where I am today as a professional speaker, it's just happened to me in a way. I won't go into the semantics of the step-by-step of what happened, but I got on one stage almost a year ago, and it was that moment of just being on that stage and knowing actually this is where I belong and this is where I want to be. And I probably sound a little bit crazy, but I've just manifested things into being from that point, and been very lucky to be surrounded by an amazing support system in the professional speaking community that have just boosted and supported and mentored me along the way.
Are more dentists as interesting as you? Because I don't want to lie, you caught me off guard. I think when we met, I really didn't expect a dentist to be so interesting, and also to have the right charisma to do this speaking thing for a living. Do you think we are misunderstanding your profession? So do you want to make a speech in defense of your profession, or we're kind of right, generally, dentists aren't as exciting?
Okay, look, nobody's as exciting as I am. Let's just face the facts here. Okay, so I can't say all dentists are this interesting. However, I will say that dentists are human beings too. We have feelings. I know that our entire profession feels to other people like we're just in it to cause pain, but actually it's not funny, but dentists have one of the highest rates of suicide and depression of any profession in the world. Sure. And it's because we're constantly at the receiving end of very toxic communication. The first thing anyone says to you when they walk into your clinic is, I hate the dentist. Whether they hate you or not. And they're like, don't take it personally. I just hate the dentist. And you're like, well, how do I not take that personally? Right. And I think, to be honest, to answer your question, I think a lot of dentists do get so caught up in the clinical and the science-based aspect of their work that they forget that they're dealing with human beings, right? And I think as a result, people have this view of dentists as very serious pain givers, and they forget that we're whole human beings with whole lives outside of the clinic, with personalities behind all the PPE and the masks, just waiting to come out. So, if I can ask your listeners, the next time you go to the dentist, like, just maybe treat them like a human being and see what happens. You might find a very interesting human being there.
I think that's an interesting thought, because I think I've had a chat with you about this, because generally when we go to the dentist, it feels like it's the dentist that wants efficiency. Let's get straight to the point. There's no reason to do any pleasantries. But you've said to me, I think before, as you are saying now, you'd be surprised at the level of human connection that our dentist is also desiring. I think I didn't know that until you've said it to me before.
Yeah. I think it depends. Again, it's very easy for me to say that, right? But I work in I have worked, at least for the last 8 years, in a very high-end, very lovely practice, where I see very high socioeconomic clients, right? And so the pressures are very different. Your pressures are to meet the needs of the patient and really create that space for them. If you were to look at, for example, when I was in dental school and working in the dental hospital in Australia, where as a student dentist, you're kind of churning out, 15, 20 patients back to back in a day, there is a little bit more time pressure, or if you look at the NHS in the UK, where there is that little bit of time pressure to churn through. And so maybe the pleasantries are skipped a little bit there, because it's kind of cut and paste. And again, I think, I think we've talked about this before, even just between Australia to Singapore, there is a difference in the expectations. So this practice that I've been at for the last 8 years is very different, because I see a lot of expat patients. So a lot of my patients here, Australian, South African, from the UK, and they want to interact with you in a different way. But prior to that, for the 5 years before that, when I first moved here, I was in very local Singaporean practices where the average Asian person treats dentistry like a commodity. And it's a very sort of transactional exchange where they're paying for your service and they just want you to give your service. And when I asked, if I was trying to make casual chat, like one day I asked a guy where he works, and he just went into panic mode, and he was like, what do you mean? Why do you need to know that? So it's really interesting, because it's really about the context of who you're even dealing with. How you approach communication.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's such a great segue to, I think, the topic that you are passionate about. I think courageous communication is a topic that you research and speak about so well. How would you then define what courageous communication is, and why do you think it's essential for today's workplace? Because what I'm hearing already from you is that context really does matter in communication.
So I think courageous communication, for me, it's interesting, because when people first talk to me about courageous communication, they assume that I talk about how do you be aggressive and how do you bring conflict into the workplace. But actually, I approach courageous communication from a very different standpoint, where courageous communication for me is about having the courage to firstly connect with yourself and know yourself deeply, so that you know where your biases and your gaps are when you're approaching a conversation, right? And then going into a conversation with someone, having the courage to be inquisitive about where they are coming from. So not going into things defensive, but being open enough and being courageous enough to hear and understand somebody else's context, and then being able to moderate and be authentic in that exchange, not jumping to conclusions, not defending straight off the back, but really truly understanding the other person and then meeting them where they are and moderating your responses. But also it all kind of comes to a head with needs-based communication, right? So much of why communication fails is based in two basic things, right? One is that fear of judgment, and two is the fear of your needs not being met. And so what I focus on is how do you use, so I have a framework, right, for courageous communication. How do you use that framework to understand yourself, understand the other person, and understand on an organizational level the needs of the organization? And then how do you verbalize and express your needs within the framework that is available to you? And finding that courage, because often people are just, people live in this victim mindset where they're like, oh, this is never going to happen for me, or I can't achieve X because of Y. But they haven't actually gotten down to recognizing what they really need to get from point A to point B. And when they have recognized it, they haven't necessarily voiced it appropriately to the right people. So what I focus on is that aspect of it.
If you want more information, please email info@theobinstitute.com and the team will get back to you, or just look at www.theobinstitute.com. Sure. I'm so interested in the two type of things you said we are concerned about every time we communicate with somebody. And the first one is just the fear of judgment. And secondly, whether our needs are going to be met. And I think about that a lot and then you mentioned then moderating our responses. I think about that a lot in terms of what people call authentic communication, right? The idea that most people, particularly, we code switch and we code switch sometimes based on the socioeconomic status of the person that we're speaking to, the context in which we're speaking to. Is that part of moderating, and is that genuine, or does it actually impede courageous communication?
That's a really interesting question. I think, to me, code switching is a great skill. I'm a third culture kid, right? Having grown up between India, China, and Australia, and having lived in Singapore and Hong Kong since, I find that code switching is a key part of what makes me me, right? And in its own way, code switching is very authentic to my very being, right? It's not inauthentic to me when I'm code switching. And I'm not doing it to be someone that I'm not.
Yes.
My code switching is just a way to put the other person at ease. So when I speak to, a taxi driver in Singapore and I'm code switching into Singlish, which is, as you've experienced recently, very interesting.
Absolutely.
It immediately disarms the other person. And I mean, I've told stories about this in dental practice, right? So I just mentioned to you, like that guy where I was like, oh, where do you work? In this very strong Australian accent. And he was just like, what's your problem? Why do you need to know this? Right? But the same thing, if I ask a patient in Singlish straight up, you got pain or not? That doesn't even make sense. To the average human being, that doesn't make sense. But to an average Singaporean patient, they're like, oh, she speaks my language,
wow.
And it immediately gives them a sense of connection and comfort. And I'm not doing it to mock them. And I think that's the key, right? I think it can impede communication if it's coming from a place of mocking the other person. But if it's coming from a genuine place of just trying to make them feel at ease, I don't think there's anything wrong with code switching.
I totally agree. I've seen instances on certain particular contexts in certain organizations where if you don't adapt your communication according to the dominant culture, in fact, the culture itself kind of spits you out. It's almost like you are not willing to know us to a point where you can meet us where we are, and then we have a genuine connection, which is also the kind of things that you are very interested in. In terms of organizations, do you have an example or two where you've seen courageous communication just like transforming an organizational culture, and where, I don't know, maybe you had seen people having their guard up, and because of somebody who understands courageous communication, who knows how to meet someone where they are, then they're able to connect much better than they did before?
So I'll give you a pretty recent example. So I was working with a marine technology company, and it was a whole group of engineers, and they're working out in this like shipyard basically, and everyone's quite macho. There's not a lot of women in the company. And I was doing this session with them about courageous communication. And one of the ladies sort of brought up with me an issue that had happened where they had a specific leader who was not approachable, right? And was not open to feedback. And something had happened, and they had held one of the employees responsible and kind of called them out in front of the others, but had not given this person a chance to explain themselves or defend themselves. And so the employees were quite up in arms about this situation, and they felt like HR weren't doing anything about it, right? And they said, "Can you help us?" Right? And it was a really interesting situation because I was just there to do a workshop, and it wasn't really my role. But then I spoke to HR and I said, "Look, can we create a situation where I might do some coaching with the leader," right? And I said to this group of people who brought this situation to me, I said, "I understand and I hear you, and I'm going to see what I can do. However, I want you to take the framework that you've just learned in this session and apply it to this leader. Because yes, to you, it feels like they've not created the space, and they've kind of scapegoated this specific person, and they've held them responsible for this situation. But has anyone stopped to understand this leader's context?" Right? And often when a leader is behaving in this way, or where you feel like they're unapproachable or you can't speak to them, very often there are other things at play in their own personal and professional context that are blocking them from being able to be the leader that you need and deserve, right? But often that is a trickle-down effect from higher up, where they're not getting the support that they need, and they're just being given deadlines and numbers that they have to meet. And it's actually beyond their pay grade at this point to sit down and hear your side of the story.
Wow.
Right? And so then when we actually went through the process of coaching with the leader, that is exactly what came out, where the leader was just under so much crunch. And the leader had a situation where they would have to potentially restructure the team and fire X many people if the deadlines weren't met, but didn't have the bandwidth to explain that to the team. So what the team are seeing and what the leader is experiencing, there's a mismatch there.
Sure.
So when the leader then has the courage to connect with their people and say, "Hey, let me be vulnerable and tell you what I'm dealing with. This is my situation. This is my reality. And this is the reality of the organization, right? Help me help you. This is the impact of this situation on me not being able to meet the needs that I need to meet of the organization." And so that just transformed how that team functioned, because suddenly you have a leader who's willing to have the courage to be vulnerable. And in that moment of vulnerability, you're creating a space for your team to come in and support you, so that you can all move up.
Yo, that makes a lot of sense to me. And sometimes words like vulnerability in many leaders may have connotations of being weak and so on. But in fact, you hear that story and you realize just the leader coming and saying, I have these pressures, this is what is happening. Not only does it elicit empathy from the team, but what it does is now the team understands the why, and they then show up very, very differently. That's so good. That's such a great example.
Yeah, and it humanizes the leader, right? It suddenly puts into context for the team, like, oh, hang on a second. This is a human being who's dealing with their own set of challenges.
Oof, I get it. I really, really hear you. You've mentioned the word framework twice now. And if my listeners are listening to this, they'll probably sue me or shout at me at the comments if I don't ask about that particular framework. Can you give us a peep of that framework without going into as much details as you would in workshops and some of your keynotes?
So it's, framework's just a fancy word, right? But my framework is called Speak Human.
Nice.
And it's actually that simple. It's about, I like it. I do like it. But each letter, so it's Speak Human, and each letter in the word human stands for something.
Mm-hmm.
And I have funny actions that go with it. So if you want to do it with me, we can do it together.
Let's go.
Yeah. So it's H for hearing, right? So you hear with your ears. So H for hearing,
Mm-hmm.
U for understanding,
Mm-hmm.
M for moderating from the heart. I don't know if you can see my heart.
I can.
M for moderating. And then it's A for authenticity, which is on your gut.
Mm-hmm.
And then N for needs, which is a clap.
Oh.
So when you get a room full of people at a keynote or at a workshop and they all clap together, it's a beautiful thing. But basically what it stands for is hearing to deeply listen. You know, often we're hearing what the other person is saying just to think about how we want to respond next. And you've already started formulating your response before the other person has even finished saying what they want to say. And you're not actually listening to their verbal and nonverbal communication. So it's that deep listening. So hearing, and then the U is understanding context. So each one of us comes with a very complex context. We have a personal, professional, social, emotional context. And it's a very dynamic thing, context, because, you know, you and I could be best friends and I might feel like I know every detail about your life. But if you woke up on the wrong side of the bed, right, or your coffee just wasn't good that morning, you might be in a bad mood that day. And that is enough sometimes to shift somebody's context.
Wow.
You know, or you might have had a phone call that's put you in a bad mood. And if I don't know that and I'm not open to hearing about it and understanding it, I might just be like, whoa, that Siphiwe guy, he's really rude, you know, just because you've had an off moment. So it's hearing, understanding context, and then M is for moderating responses. So when you deeply understand and you deeply hear someone, it's a lot easier to not react in the moment. And it's a lot easier to moderate how you react and respond to them and not get fired up as much because you're taking that beat to understand them. And the A, which is the authenticity, is really, really important because as you moderate yourself, right, it's important not to lose your authenticity in that because there is something as like going too far, you know, especially now where we're so politically correct all the time in how we're conversing, you can lose that authenticity. So how do you hold on to your authentic self and make sure you say what you want to say, but in a way that's not necessarily offensive, right? I think you and I do it through humor. We just turn it into a joke and we're like, ha ha, you know, and that's authentic to us. And then the last part, which is the N, is needs. And the reason that it's a clap is because you can't physically clap with one hand, right? It takes two hands to clap, and that's the two parts of need. And that's need identification is one part, but then you have to be able to express your needs. And if you can't express it, you can't clap. So that's the framework.
I just realized why you're so good at relationships. It's this framework. It's this framework. Do you think growing up in India, China, and Australia and these multicultural experiences have influenced you to get to this point where you have that ability to speak human and to speak about courageous communication in general?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think just growing up in India, if I had just grown up there, maybe I would not have been the same. I think it's having had to move. I moved from India to China when I was 14. And that's a really impressionable age. And it's an age where all you want to do is fit in. And so I think having moved at that stage of my life, and then I moved from China to Australia when I was 15 and a half, those years and that change and that adaptation, I think really taught me a lot. And I think it taught me, obviously, the code switching, the understanding that people come from different backgrounds. And I think it just kind of made it very inherent to me. And I do think also, the time that we kind of grew up in, to some extent, I feel like we grew up protecting the feelings of the adults around us a little bit. And I felt like, in a way, I was always sort of making up for the adults around me in a way, where they would just say things and you're like, hang on a second, you can't say that, And so you would go the other way to try to protect people's feelings and kind of be like, okay, how do I manage, like, damage control this situation? So I think all of that combined together has probably led me where I am. But then I think the dentistry played a huge part as well, right? Because if you think about the average person coming into the dentist's office, like I said to you, the first thing they say is, I hate you. I don't want to be here. This is going to hurt. This is going to be expensive. And you're basically taking these people from this really toxic point, right? And you're trying to get them to a place where they're going to lie down flat in the dental chair and then open their mouths and let you stick really sharp metal objects in their mouths and make them bleed.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're going to do this willingly. So if you combine all of those things, I think that gets you to be pretty good at communication, I'd say.
I think so too. And therefore, I think you are best positioned to give leaders, particularly in big corporates, one or two ideas about how to then foster this inclusivity and just celebrate that diversity within the teams. I think in the context of DEI, I'm seeing a big role of this type of courageous communication. Could you give some of our leaders maybe one or two ideas on how they could foster that inclusivity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Siphiwe, I really want to bring up a theme here that I've been seeing a lot and I've been dealing with a lot with clients. And that's this whole concept of multi-generational workforces, right? And I think communication across generations has been a really big issue that's kind of come up in the last few years, because we're talking about a workforce and workplaces that are almost 4 generations in the workplace now. When you hear now? Every generation, because you've still got boomers, right? You've got baby boomers, you've got Gen X, you've got Gen Y, and then you've got Gen Z. True. And across the board, you're hearing people complaining about the communication skills of everybody else. And I think that the big thing that I would say to leaders here is there's a lot of misconception around Gen Z, and there's a lot of kind of blowback against Gen Z and how they're entitled and they're, you know, they don't want to work. And it's just not true. It's not true that they don't want to work. And yes, maybe they are entitled to an extent, but they're entitled in some ways for all the right reasons, right? And I feel like they've kind of cracked the code on this whole work-life balance thing. And they're the first generation to come out and verbalize and courageously communicate the fact that, yes, my job is a big part of my life. And yes, it pays my bills, but it doesn't define who I am.
So true.
Right? And I'm not going to allow you to put me in a space where my job defines my entire life. Right? And so I think if leaders can start to really apply this sort of framework or, you know, whatever, however they want to approach it, but if you start to create space for conversations where you're willing to understand the context and the motivators of individuals, you know, whether they're Gen Z, whether they're Gen Y, if you start to treat them as individual human beings and recognize that each of them is driven by different things and that each of them values different things, you really can create workplaces where you're drawing the best out of these individuals because you're creating an optimal workspace and an optimal kind of setting for them to shine.
Absolutely. And as we emphasize a lot in this podcast, when you're creating a space for people to shine, that's good in for its own sake. But interestingly, it then also leads into the outcomes that leaders want. They want an engaged employee, they want productivity, they want performance, and so on. So it's not this wishy-washy kumbaya thing, but generally it leads them to the outcomes that leaders want.
Yeah. And you know, so I was at a D&I conference a couple of months ago, and it was interesting because there was this panel discussion and they were talking about, you know, meeting individual needs and valuing individuality, right? And actually I ended up asking this question, like, how woke is too woke, right? And I think there's a difference here between wokeness and valuing human beings as individuals, right? And I think finding that where that line is and finding, you know, where you're at a point of creating productivity and employee engagement and a sense of belonging and a sense of desire for a shared goal and a shared success versus just pandering to random sort of woke trends, right? And I think therein there are some blurred lines. And I think when leaders can create, like you were saying, this space for these types of conversations, they can really cut out the nonsense versus the things that are going to drive impact for their employees.
I've never thought of that. I've actually never thought of some people may actually swing the pendulum way too far and pander to just nonsense, as you call it. That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. You've also emphasized the importance of meeting people where they are, right? In fact, you've mentioned it. Do you think leaders can also use that particular principles for team dynamics and performance? I get a sense that's a yes, and I think you've been saying if you use the Speak Human framework, for example, in team dynamics, people would feel seen, understood, and so on. Would that be true?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you know, I've said this to you before as well. Like, I think it's a very basic human need to want to feel seen, heard, and understood, right? And I've heard actually, I've heard someone use the word significant as well in there. And I think it all ties in together, because who wants to be rejected, or who wants to be made to feel like they don't matter or what they're saying doesn't matter, right? It just doesn't make logical sense. None of us want to be feeling that way. So in a team environment, if you're trying to empower your team, especially, and I see this especially in teams where they're trying to push for innovation, right? Where you're trying to get people to push beyond the status quo and really push the boundary, the more you give them that sense of being valued and seen and heard, the more they're going to push and the more they're going to succeed. But the importance of that meeting people where they are, again, it comes back to what I was saying. There's meeting people where they are, and then there's going too far. And I think meeting people where they are is really about just connecting in a space that is authentic to you, but is still comfortable for them. Right? So you don't have to be someone that you're not to meet people where they are. But if you can understand, I tell this story in my keynotes all the time, and I was telling you before about these patients that I was seeing, and they just didn't trust me when I first moved to Singapore. My local patients, they just thought I was a maniac, really, with my very Australian ways. And it was a conversation that I had at one point with someone who said to me, actually, they don't trust you because you're talking too much, right? And they just think you're wasting time. And they think that your charges, your consultation fees are time-based. And so the more you talk to them, the more money you're going to charge them. And so they don't trust you, right? Now, when I take that and I say, okay, well, actually, that makes total sense. Let me cut to the chase with these people, right? Or let me tell them that my time is not money, but it kind of is, right? So I just cut to the chase with them. And so they much preferred that. Yeah. And then they got on with it. And then we got places with that, So sometimes it's as simple as just understanding a mindset in the person that you're trying to communicate with, and to go beyond just your message and what you want to say, but just to, for a moment, consider how are they going to receive this, right? And how can I say this in a way that it's going to be received to have the impact that I need it to have?
Yeah.
So that's what meeting people where they are is about.
It makes a lot of sense. I think the idea that I've spoken, whether people understand me or not, is a cop-out. That's not full communication. You have to care about whether people hear exactly what you want them to hear or not. So I hear that very well. All right. I think another thing that is very, very interesting is your transition, right? Your transition to dentistry, to speaking and coaching is an interesting one, right? And now you also kind of help people with their career transitions as well. So I'm very curious, what key elements really contribute to a successful and fulfilling career change? Because there's a lot of people who are thinking about a career change. It probably sounds daunting to them. Any words of wisdom you could give to our listeners?
I have many words of wisdom. All my words are of wisdom. Like Donald Trump, I have good words.
Good words?
Yeah, I have all the good words. But I think a few things contribute to fulfilling transitions. And I think for me, a big one is a sense of control, right? I think human beings desire control as a base need. And I think when we feel like we are making the decisions and we're owning the consequences of those decisions, it makes the transition easier, and I understand that that's a very privileged way of looking at it. But there's lots of people who end up having to transition because they get retrenched and they don't necessarily have that privilege, right? But I would say to those people as well, I think controlling your narrative and taking a moment to sort of reassess what is important to you and what you want your legacy to be and what you want the next 20 or 30 years to look like, and how can you set yourself up for that? And I often say to people, I've been really lucky that I have the financial sort of backing of a partner who can pay the bills while I figure my way out. And not everyone has that. So for those people, I say it's okay for you to stay in a job or take on a job that may not be that fulfillment for you. And that's okay, because you can do a job without necessarily attaching your identity to it, and sow the seeds around it for what you really think is going to fulfill you.
So good.
Right. And it's okay. It's okay to take your time to set yourself up in that way. So you're playing the long game. It's not a short-term fulfillment. It's not an instantaneous satisfaction thing, you know? It's really building that legacy and finding that fulfillment. And I do think the other thing is being realistic about what your situation is. You know, I touched on this just a moment ago, that if you're struggling to pay your bills and then you decide to quit your job, and then you're going to try to figure out what that thing is that's going to fulfill you, chances are you're going to actually struggle to find it, right? Because at the end of the day, the reality of life and the reality of needing to pay the bills or put your kids through school or, you know, put food on the table is going to kick in. So making sure that your base case scenario is covered. So as I stepped into this transition, like my husband and I talked about it, and, you know, I'm the type of person who considers my worst case scenario. And my worst case scenario as I stepped into this transition was that I do nothing for a year or two, right? I don't figure out what it is I want to do. I don't set up a business. I make nothing of this 2 years, but I spend these 1 or 2 years just focusing on my young kids. Right. And that was my worst case scenario, which actually is a pretty cool, special, awesome scenario to have.
Of course.
And so that made my transition, it took a lot of the pressure off of the transition. Right. And so I think I would say for anyone who is considering a transition that they're making out of choice, just make sure that you've set up all your real parameters and your real sort of safety nets, so that you can be caught if you fall.
I think that
and
is...
the other thing is that nothing is permanent, you know? You, just because you make a transition from A to B doesn't mean B now defines you, you know? And I just think this is it's been a really beautiful change for me, just untangling my identity from my profession. And I think if you come to accept that, and you accept that you can be and do lots of different things along the way, as long as you're driven and you're passionate, you will find what satisfies you and fulfills you eventually.
I think for me, that's a very practical, pragmatic approach. And it doesn't sound very motivational speaker. You have to go all in, sell your car. I don't want to sell my car.
You got to live. You still have to live. And, you know, I mean, especially in Singapore, you've been here, you've seen how expensive Singapore is, right? Like, you can't just be like, oh, peace out, I'm just going to quit my job and do nothing. It's just not realistic.
Yeah. No, I love that. I want to nudge us to a close, because I think there are other ways people can engage your work even more. But maybe you could leave us, if you think about... I've heard now there's something called courageous communication. I've heard that we can create organizations where we can have nice open dialogue. And what are some of the 1 or 2 things that leaders can do if they really want to now develop that skill? Because I'm assuming it's a skill and therefore it takes a bit of time.
Well, they can hire me for starters.
Absolutely.
Yep. I think, but I'm serious, you know, so the work that I do specifically is I do coaching with leaders, so one-on-one coaching. But then I also do team coaching and workshops with teams where we break down some of these barriers and we start to open up that communication within a team so that they can continue the work beyond the work that we do together. And I think for leaders who are looking to make that change or are looking to shift a dynamic with their teams, I would say the first step really is to get to know yourself, right? To apply the framework to yourself and to really take a long, deep, hard look at who you are as a leader and what you want your legacy to be as a leader. How do you want your team to see you? How do you want them to respond to you? And what is it that's stopping you from being the leader that you would like to be? Because when you really look at yourself and you identify your own sort of, I don't want to call them weaknesses, but kind of blind spots, and you start to work on those, it also opens you up to then being inquisitive about other people. So I would say that's kind of step one to going down this path of really shifting team dynamics. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just that curiosity about other human beings, but knowing yourself is such a good thing. I mean, as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking a lot about that nice tension between authenticity and moderating myself to make sure that I meet someone else. It's such a nice sweet spot for me, and I'm really, really already thinking about whether I do that enough, I do that well, and I do that to firstly to fulfill my authentic self, but also just understanding that the idea that someone is going to say, this is how I speak, finish, that's not really good for building relationship with your team, with anybody else. So you have to think about how you're doing that. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Before I then ask you how people can get hold of you if they want to work with you and so on, I want to give you, imagine you had a 40 seconds tweet or a TikTok short that just whets people's appetite around your work, and you want to give a quick advice on embracing courageous communication, connecting with people and speaking human. Imagine it as a closing shot. We have it now. We've zoomed in. We're zooming in. And did I create enough drama?
I'm feeling the feels. I'm starting to sweat, Siphiwe. It's lucky no one can see my armpits in this.
Just as a closing shot, parting shot, 40 seconds, it's going everywhere. We've zoomed in. Here's your closing remarks.
Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
So I'm going to say to anyone listening today, please speak human, speak to yourself first before you try to connect with anybody else, because the thing that drives the most communication conflicts is a fear of judgment. And if you've taken the time to really judge yourself, and you've taken the time to really understand and reflect on what's making you you, that's when you can truly be inquisitive about the people around you. And driving your message and your communication is not about what you have to say. It's about who's receiving it and how they're going to receive it. So please speak human, apply it to all those around you after you've applied it to yourself first.
We're going to add those effects.
Yeah. Drum rolls.
And
I want like fireworks, Siphiwe.
Oh, we would love a bit of humility from our guests, guys.
I really hope that kind of gets the key message to whoever needs to hear it.
Definitely. All right. So how do we work with you? How do we find, if we want to hear more about your work, or whether we want to invite you for a keynote, for a workshop, for some coaching, or just follow your work, where do we go?
I think the best way to reach me is probably LinkedIn. So you can look me up on LinkedIn, Dr. Damini Chawla. I think there is actually only one of me in the world.
Nice.
So there you go. I'm one of 6 billion. So look me up on LinkedIn. I am also on Instagram, just at dr.Damini Chawla. And I'm sure, Siphiwe, you can also share my email and my WhatsApp details. So I'm happy for people to reach out with whatever they're most comfortable with. It's about meeting people where they are. So whatever makes them tick. And in order to be able to work with me, just reach out. We can always arrange just a 20-minute, I do a 20-minute discovery call, and that's free of charge. Because I really want to understand what's driving people and what's making them reach out to me and how I can help them or support them. So we do a 20-minute discovery call and then we take it from there. So I do keynotes, I do workshops, coaching and consulting.
Damini, thank you so much for coming. This was a great, enriching conversation. We really, really appreciate you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was another episode of Organizational Behavior with Siphiwe Moyo. What an incredible guest. I've always told you guys I have incredible guests. I don't know why you still doubt me. Peace, we are out.